Imagine being trapped 30 feet underground, surrounded by concrete walls 3 meters thick, while the entire world above you burns. The man who once commanded armies across Europe now paces a cramped bunker, his hands trembling uncontrollably, his face gray and gaunt. Outside, Soviet artillery shells rain down every few seconds. Inside, the most powerful dictator of the 20th century is planning his final act. This is not the Hitler of the propaganda films. This is not the man who mesmerized millions at Nuremberg. This is a broken shell of a human being living his last moments in a tomb of his own making. What you're about to hear are the real documented details of Hitler's final days. Details that are stranger, more disturbing, and more human than any dramatization could capture. This is the untold story of how the Third Reich died in a basement beneath Berlin. Let's set the scene. It's January 16, 1945. Adolf Hitler enters the Führerbunker for what will be the last time. This isn't his first underground refuge, but it will be his tomb. The Führerbunker sat beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden in Berlin, 18 rooms of reinforced concrete, buried deep enough to withstand direct artillery hits. Well, mostly. The bunker had 2 levels, the upper Führerbunker, where staff worked, and the lower Führerbunker proper, where Hitler and his inner circle existed in their final days. The conditions were absolutely nightmarish. Despite being designed as a state-of-the-art shelter, the bunker was damp, poorly ventilated, and claustrophobic. The diesel generators that powered the lights and the ventilation system created a constant rumble and smell. There were about 18 small rooms total, bedrooms, a conference room, a small switchboard, and basic facilities. But here's what most people don't realize. Hitler was already a physical and mental wreck by the time he descended into the bunker. His doctor, Theodor Morell, had been injecting him with a cocktail of drugs for years, including methamphetamine, oxycodone, and dozens of other substances. Hitler's left hand shook uncontrollably from what was likely Parkinson's disease. He shuffled when he walked. At 56 years old, he looked like a man in his 70s. The man who entered that bunker was paranoid, delusional, and increasingly detached from reality. He would spend hours staring at architectural models of Linz, the Austrian city he dreamed of rebuilding after his final victory. Victory? The Red Army was already in the suburbs of Berlin. Who stayed with Hitler in these final days? The cast of characters in the bunker reads like a list of history's most infamous names, but also includes some surprising figures you've probably never heard of. First, there was Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister who moved his entire family into the bunker, including his 6 children, ranging in age from 4 to 12. Yes, 6 children in an underground bunker while Berlin burned above them. We'll come back to their fate later, and I warn you, it's one of the most disturbing parts of this story. Then there was Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary and one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, despite being virtually unknown to the public. Bormann controlled access to Hitler and was constantly jockeying for power even as the regime collapsed. Eva Braun, Hitler's longtime companion, arrived at the bunker in early April, against Hitler's wishes. She refused to leave him. Their relationship had been kept secret from the German public for years. In these final days, that would change. The military staff included General Wilhelm Burgdorf and General Hans Krebs, who spent their time presenting increasingly fictional reports about German divisions that no longer existed, counterattacks that would never come, and rescue operations that were pure fantasy. Then there were the secretaries, the guards, the cooks, ordinary people trapped in an extraordinary nightmare. Traudl Junge, one of Hitler's personal secretaries, would later write a memoir describing the surreal atmosphere. Champagne parties while Berlin was being destroyed, dancing while people died by the thousands above them, Hitler playing with Goebbels' children while planning his suicide. But here's what's truly chilling. Many of these people were fanatically loyal to the end. They weren't all coerced. They believed. Even as the reality of defeat became undeniable, they clung to their faith in Hitler and the Nazi cause. The bunker became a twisted microcosm of the Nazi state itself, filled with intrigue, backstabbing, denial, and delusion. Officers would emerge from meetings with Hitler where they'd been told about imminent relief forces, only to step outside and see Soviet tanks rolling down the streets. As April 1945 progressed, Hitler's grip on reality loosened even further. Let me paint you a picture of what daily life looked like in those final weeks. Hitler's routine had become nocturnal and chaotic. He would sleep until midday, then spend hours in conference meetings where he moved around phantom armies on maps. He would erupt in rage at his generals, blaming them for betrayals and incompetence. He still believed that some miracle weapon or unexpected alliance would save Germany at the last moment. There's a particularly telling incident from April 22nd. During a military briefing, Hitler was finally confronted with the reality that SS General Felix Steiner's relief attack, which Hitler had been counting on, wasn't going to happen. Steiner didn't have enough troops. The attack had never really been launched. Hitler exploded. This wasn't his usual controlled anger. This was a complete breakdown. He screamed that he'd been betrayed by everyone, that the German people were unworthy of him, that cowardice and treachery had defeated him, not the Allies. He shouted that the war was lost, that everything was over, that he would stay in Berlin and shoot himself when the time came. His staff was shocked. Hitler had never before admitted defeat so clearly. For a few hours, there was chaos in the bunker. Some urged him to flee to the mountains of Bavaria, where supposedly an Alpine fortress could make a last stand. Hitler refused. He said he would die in Berlin. But even after this breakdown, the delusion continued. Within days, Hitler was back to planning offensives with divisions that didn't exist. He ordered the flooding of the Berlin subway tunnels to slow the Soviet advance, even though thousands of German civilians and wounded soldiers were sheltering there. Estimates suggest up to 15,000 people may have drowned. The man had become a monster, consuming his own people. On April 28th, something unexpected happened in the bunker. Hitler decided to marry Eva Braun. Just after midnight on April 29th, a small wedding ceremony took place in the bunker's map room. A city official named Walter Wagner, who was fighting with the local Volkssturm militia, was brought in to officiate. He was still in his uniform, covered in dust from the battle outside. The ceremony was brief and bureaucratic. Hitler and Eva signed the marriage register. There was a technical hiccup. Eva started to sign her name, Eva B., then crossed it out and wrote Eva Hitler, born Braun. Even in this moment, the Nazi obsession with paperwork persisted. After the ceremony, there was a small wedding breakfast with champagne and sandwiches. Witnesses reported that the mood was bizarrely cheerful, considering that Soviet troops were now only blocks away. Hitler spoke nostalgically about the past and his dog Blondie, an Alsatian he was deeply attached to. But Hitler had other business that night. He retreated to his room and dictated his last will and political testament to his secretary, Traudl Junge. These documents are fascinating and disturbing. Hitler's political testament blamed the Jews for starting the war. Even in his final hours, his anti-Semitism remained his defining characteristic. He expelled Himmler and Goering from the Nazi Party for trying to negotiate with the Allies. He appointed Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor as head of state. His personal will was simpler. He left his possessions to the Nazi Party, or if it no longer existed, to the German state. He mentioned his art collection, and he explained that he and his wife had chosen death over surrender or capture. The most chilling part? There was no remorse, no acknowledgement of the millions who had died because of his actions, no moment of clarity or regret, just blame, bitterness, and defiance to the end. April 30th, 1945. Hitler's last day on Earth. The morning started with grim news. Mussolini had been captured by Italian partisans, executed, and his body hung upside down in a public square in Milan for crowds to abuse. When Hitler heard this, he became very quiet. He told his staff that he would not allow his body to be displayed as a trophy for the Soviets. Throughout the day, Hitler said his goodbyes. He was calm, almost serene. He shook hands with the staff, thanked them for their service. Some witnesses reported that his eyes were watery, but he didn't break down. Around 2:30 p.m., Hitler and Eva retired to their private quarters, a small suite consisting of a bedroom, a bathroom, and a sitting room. What happened next has been reconstructed from testimony and forensic evidence. Hitler tested the cyanide capsules he'd obtained to make sure they worked. How? He had his beloved dog, Blondie, poisoned with one. The dog died almost instantly. This detail is so coldly methodical, it's almost incomprehensible. Even Hitler's final act of care for his dog was actually about him. Shortly after 3 p.m., Hitler's valet heard a single gunshot. Otto Günsche, Hitler's personal adjutant, and Martin Bormann entered the suite. They found Hitler sitting on a small sofa, dead from a gunshot wound to the right temple. A Walther pistol lay at his feet. Eva was beside him, also dead. She had bitten into a cyanide capsule. The smell of bitter almonds filled the small room. The bodies were wrapped in blankets and carried up the stairs to the Reich Chancellery garden. This was dangerous. Soviet artillery was still falling, and there was active fighting nearby. But Hitler had given explicit orders: burn the bodies beyond recognition. The corpses were placed in a shallow crater, doused with gasoline, and set alight. The bunker survivors gave the Hitler salute as the bodies burned. But the cremation was incomplete. There wasn't enough gasoline, and the fire was repeatedly interrupted by Soviet shelling. Eventually, the partially burned remains were quickly buried in a shell crater. Meanwhile, back in the bunker, Joseph and Magda Goebbels made their own preparations. What happened after Hitler's death is almost as disturbing as what came before. The Goebbels family stayed in the bunker. On May 1st, the day after Hitler's death, Joseph and Magda Goebbels murdered their 6 children: Helga, Hilda, Helmut, Hulda, Hedda, and Haida. The children were first drugged, then killed with cyanide. Magda Goebbels personally placed the cyanide capsules in her children's mouths while they were unconscious. The children ranged in age from 4 to 12 years old. Afterwards, Joseph and Magda went up to the garden, where they too committed suicide, though accounts differ on exactly how. Their bodies were also burned, but like Hitler's, incompletely. Other bunker inhabitants tried to escape. Some succeeded in breaking through Soviet lines in small groups. Many were captured or killed. Martin Bormann's fate remained uncertain for decades. His body wasn't positively identified until 1998 through DNA testing. He had died trying to escape Berlin, likely by suicide. But what about Hitler's body? This is where the story gets even stranger. Soviet troops found the burned remains in the Reich Chancellery garden on May 4th. But Stalin, paranoid and suspicious, kept the discovery secret. For years, the Soviets publicly claimed they hadn't found Hitler's body, fueling conspiracy theories that he had escaped. In reality, Soviet intelligence had recovered what remained of Hitler and Eva's corpses. The bodies were identified through dental records. Hitler's distinctive dental work was unmistakable. The remains were buried, then dug up and moved multiple times over the years as the Soviets worried about the graves becoming Nazi shrines. Finally, in 1970, the Soviet KGB exhumed the remains one last time, burned them completely, crushed the ashes, and scattered them in a river near Magdeburg, East Germany. Hitler's corpse had literally been erased from the earth. Except for one piece, the Soviets kept a fragment of Hitler's skull with a bullet hole in it as evidence, or at least they claimed it was Hitler's skull. In 2009, DNA testing revealed that the skull fragment actually belonged to a woman, possibly Eva Braun, or possibly not from the bunker at all. The mystery, in some small way, endures. So what are we to make of Hitler's last days? What strikes me most studying this history is the banality alongside the horror. Here was a man responsible for the deaths of tens of millions, who started the deadliest war in human history, who industrialized genocide, and his final days were spent in a cramped, smelly basement, deluded, sick, and pathetic. There's no redemption in this story. There's no last-minute realization of the evil he'd done. There's no dramatic confrontation or cosmic justice. There's just a broken man shooting himself in a bunker while his world burned above him, a world he had set on fire. Hitler's suicide was his final act of control, his final refusal to face consequences. He denied the Allies their day in court, their chance to prosecute him for his crimes. He denied the German people their chance to see him held accountable. In a sense, his suicide was his last act of cowardice disguised as defiance. The story of Hitler's last days is not a story of a fall from greatness. There was never any greatness to fall from. It's the story of how poisonous ideology, unchecked power, and moral bankruptcy inevitably lead to destruction, not just of enemies, but of everything the ideology touches, including itself. The bunker still exists beneath Berlin, though it's sealed and unmarked. The city built a parking lot and apartment buildings over it. Life goes on. Berlin rebuilt, Germany rebuilt, the world rebuilt. But we remember these final days not out of morbid fascination, but as a warning. This is where totalitarianism leads. This is where hatred leads. This is where the rejection of truth and human dignity leads, to a concrete tomb 30 feet underground, where a monster died alone, while the world he tried to conquer celebrated his defeat. Thanks for watching. If you found this video informative, please like and subscribe. And leave a comment. What aspect of this history did you find most striking? See you in the next video.